There are a lot of important figures in organic farming history. J.I. Rodale, for example, is the name most people associate with first bringing organic farming to the United States. But another very important person who is not often mentioned is Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. And in this presentation, which I originally gave at the Fellowship of Preparation Makers, a biodynamic conference at Kimberton, Pennsylvania, I am going to explain why Ehrenfried Pfeiffer played a very important role in bringing organic farming to the United States. So today I'm going to talk about where the word organic came from and what that had to do with Pfeiffer, the importance of Kimberton, where I gave this presentation in organic farming history, and a question that has often been asked is, was there a falling out between Ehrenfried Pfeiffer and J.I. Rodale? And I will conclude with talking about Pfeiffer's lasting influence on organic farming. So first of all, where did the word organic come from? So the general consensus in basically all published histories up to this point is that the word organic farming was first used by Lord Northbourne in a 1940 book that he published titled Look to the Land. In that book, Lord Northbourne said, mixed farming is real farming. Unduly specialized farming is something else. It must depend on imported fertility. It cannot be self-sufficient nor an organic whole. The farm must be organic in more senses than one. In the long run, the results of attempting to substitute chemical farming for organic farming will very probably prove far more deleterious than has yet become clear. And that right there, where he said organic chemical farming for organic farming, is where he used that term. However, it's the only place in the book that he used the term. But it's the first time that that actual phrase organic farming was used in a published book. So the consensus has been that Northbourne coined it. But then I discovered something very fascinating when I was going through the Rodale archives at Lehigh University. I ran across some correspondence that Ralph Rodale, the son of J.I. Rodale, had with Lord Northbourne in the 1980s. In 1982, he ran across Northbourne's book for the first time, and he was like, wait a minute, I thought my dad coined the phrase organic farming, and then look, here's Northbourne using it 2 years before J.I. Rodale ever did. So Bob Rodale's like, man, I wonder if Northbourne's still alive. So he contacted his editor in England, Ned Halley, and he asked him, hey, is Northbourne still alive? And Halley got back and he said, yeah, he actually is. And he wrote him a letter, and in that letter, Lord Northbourne said, I was certainly not the first to apply the word organic to farming or gardening. I have never known the ideas and practices involved under any other name. So Bob Rodale was like, whoa, wait a minute. So Northbourne's saying he didn't coin it, that he had heard this term somewhere else. So the question is, where did he hear it? So he called him up on the phone. Northbourne was very old at this point, and he was very ill. He died only a couple months later. And so he said the term organic farming was used commonly in newspaper articles ever since the end of World War I. So Bob Rodale goes off on this whole tangent. He's like, well, maybe newspapers. He must mean the London Times. So I should get a whole army of grad students and they should search the London Times to try to find if this phrase organic farming really was used. Because back in that day, before the internet, that's what it would have taken. Somebody would have had to go through all of those documents. Fortunately, Bob did not waste the time, because today you can just type in the phrase organic farming on the London Times website, which I did, and it will search all their archives, and it turned up nothing. So it was not used in the London Times. So that was just a rabbit trail. So, but where was it used? So the historian John Paul has recorded in several very interesting articles. He did a lot of research on Northbourne's connection to this phrase, and he said that in 1939, Northbourne hosted a biodynamic farming conference at his estate, the Bedeshanger Summer School. At that conference, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer was one of the keynote speakers. So, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer comes up behind this. So, he used it, never used it before he heard Pfeiffer speak, used it shortly after he heard Pfeiffer speak. But then I ran across something else really interesting. So, as I'm doing this research in 1937, the School of Living. So the School of Living is located right up in Suffolk, New York. It's only 7 miles away from a very important biodynamic farming, actually the earliest biodynamic farming community in the United States, called Threefold Farm. It's only 7 miles away. And so in 1937, Ralph Borsodi, who founded the School of Living, he started using this term organic agriculture in 1937. And he started using this in the context of a lecture that he attended at Threefold Farm. And so, in describing this lecture, they said and I don't know for sure who wrote this, it was in their newsletter Homestead Notes. It could have been Pfeiffer, it could have been Borsodi, or it could have been someone else. But he said, a distinguished agricultural scientist, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer of Holland, has been lecturing in the United States during the past 2 months. What Mr. Pfeiffer has been saying about the correct way to farm is not only of the greatest importance to agriculture, it is of the greatest importance from a social standpoint. In addition, it is a contribution to the homestead movement of first-rate practical importance. His experiments show that land which we call submarginal can be used to produce abundantly by returning to the organic agriculture which prevailed before the era of specialization and chemical science, what we are calling organic agriculture. And what Mr. Pfeiffer calls the biodynamic method is based upon the maintenance of the fertility of the soil indefinitely by using humus or compost instead of chemical fertilizers. So he's saying right here, he's using this term organic agriculture in reference to biodynamic farming, and is using it right after he heard Pfeiffer speak. So then at the School of Living, they continued to promote biodynamic farming for the next about 5 years, and they use those words biodynamic and organic interchangeably. So the big question I had after I ran across this, I was like, okay, Northbourne finds this word right after he listens to Pfeiffer speak. And then the School of Living, they also start using it right after they listen to Pfeiffer speak. So did Pfeiffer himself use that phrase organic farming? So I looked in his book, his 1938 book, Biodynamic Farming and Gardening, and he did not use the phrase organic farming in his book. I did not find that particular phrase because he always used the term biodynamic farming because that's what the book was about. However, he did frequently use the phrase organic whole. So he explains the whole is not the mere sum of its parts, but a harmonic unity of a higher order, which as organic being, as an organism with laws of a higher order, lifts the world of the physico-chemical inorganic to the world of the organic living. And then he said, the ways and means for the regeneration, he used the word regeneration too, oh boy, anyhow, the ways and means for the regeneration of the farm can be found only in a comprehensive view of the earth as an organism, as a living entity. And then, when he's talking about the farm, he said, the solution of the agricultural crisis of the present time is a human spiritual problem. It consists in man's extending his knowledge of life being, of life's laws, and in the creation of a method of thought founded on the principle of an organic whole. So what he meant by that phrase organic whole was that was to consider the earth, the farm, as an organism, a holistic perspective, not reductionism that said, oh, you got your soil here, you got your plants here, you got your animals here, and they're all totally separate, not related. This idea of an organic whole is what Pfeiffer used frequently. And so every contender for coining that phrase organic farming did so after Pfeiffer spoke on this concept of the organic whole. So this is the question I have that I don't think I'll ever be able to answer is, did Pfeiffer use that term organic agriculture orally? This is what I wonder. Or is it because these people were not biodynamic farmers, they wanted to talk about biodynamic farming but not use that word, and so because Pfeiffer used the word organic, they used that. And this is what I don't know, but I do think it's pretty safe to say that everybody that used that phrase organic did so right after listening to Pfeiffer speak. Another really interesting side note on this is that some of the people who were really excited about Pfeiffer's idea of the organic whole were the Catholics. So the Catholic rural life movement was very strong in the 1930s. Luigi Liguori was the president of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, and he co-authored a book with John Raw in 1940 called Rural Roads to Security. And in that, they promoted biodynamic farming. And they said that the small, highly diversified, biodynamic family unit farm was the most effective system of husbandry. And they totally talked about the organic whole. They said in discussing the biodynamic method, they said their method aims to make a farm live and produce as a self-contained organism, and not as the average farmer thinks of it today as a series of unrelated processes. And then they said the concept of the organic in society must return as the basis of thought and action. And in that case, they're talking about society functioning as an organism, as a community, as opposed to a machine, mechanistic. And then they further said the farmer lives in a natural world. The city man lives in an injurious, artificial world. The farmer's thoughts are largely organic, biological, while the city man's thoughts are industrial, mechanical. The farmer thinks in terms of plants and animals, and the city man tends to think of wheels and machines, buying and selling. The movement away from the farm into the city has not merely meant a change in the post office address. A far-reaching change in one's philosophy of life is often involved in the move. And so they emphasize that idea of the farm as an organic whole to return to the organic in society. And there was also a critique of materialism, which was exactly what the biodynamic farmers were critiquing. They were both advocating a return to the spiritual, integrating the spiritual and physical together. And the Catholics always cited Pfeiffer's work, and they were not scared off by the spiritual aspect of it. They embraced it because they found it quite compatible with Christianity, and they're like, well, but God made the world to have a spiritual component, and that's just how it is. So then what we have next, okay, so after all this, we have this biodynamic and organic farming. This word is kind of being thrown out. And so then the next really important stage in this history is when Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, he was in Holland. He was managing a farm called Rodale. It was over 800 acres. It was extremely successful. They had a bakery, they had a dairy, they had vegetables. They grew them in greenhouses all winter. The food was amazing. It was great. And then the Nazis invaded, and the Dutch, in a futile effort to stop the invasion, this was in the Polder lands, and they flooded them as part of their defense system. Unfortunately, that didn't stop the bomber planes, and the Nazis still conquered Holland. In the process, the farm was destroyed. But fortunately, just about the time that this happened, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer got an invitation from this oil millionaire named Alaric Marin to come to a series of farms near Philadelphia, where he wanted to start a biodynamic training school. And this was right next to the little town of Kimberton, and so they decided to call it Kimberton Farm School. So Marin had bought over 800 acres of property, including this house that I have the picture of here is actually the house that Pfeiffer lived in. And I'll show you where they had the classes on the next slide. So they first started teaching about biodynamic farming in February of 1941. And then they also started taking on year-round students who learned composting, dairy farming, vegetable production, and herb growing. So every aspect of what it takes to manage a successful farm. And this picture on the bottom here is the very beautiful, ornate building in which they held these classes. It's now a Waldorf school. It's been quite well maintained. The biggest course they ever held. So they had the year-round students, and then they also had the short-term courses. And so the biggest short-term course they ever held was in the winter of 1942. It was over 6 weeks, a very intensive 6 weeks. So like classes all day, every Monday through Friday, and then 2 of the weekends they had a full conference on both Saturday and Sunday. So you went like 3 weeks with not even a single day off. It was very intensive. And they covered practically everything. Like Pfeiffer talked about soil, chemistry and biology, farm bookkeeping, the feeding of beef cattle, the judging of Angus cattle, what a farmer must know and do for a sick animal, what a farmer should know about stars, poultry feeding and health, the observation of weather, the use of farm machines and their upkeep, the significance of plants other than the cultivated ones, the treatment of an orchard. I can't even read the whole list because there were so many different things. So everybody that went there were like, yeah, it was great. I mean, so much information, but it was really exhausting to have it so intense. Now, there were only about 60 or 70 people who attended this. However, some of them turned out to be really important. So one of the attendees were Paul and Betty Keene. There's a picture of them right up here. And Paul and Betty Keene were the ones who went on to found Walnut Acres, which became the largest mail order organic food company in the United States. And so they learned everything about organic farming at the Kimberton Farm School. And so Paul Keen wrote later, he talked about what it was like. So again, this was like so intensive, the work that these year-round students did here. So here's a description by Evelyn Spiden Gregg. She wrote some articles about this for Biodynamics. So she said the workday began earliest for students assigned to the dairies under the supervision of an experienced dairyman at each barn. Milking started at 5 a.m. and the dairy assignment was for several weeks because dairy cows do not take kindly to frequent changes. Each cow's milk production was recorded at each milking just after feeding. Then the students went for their breakfast and the morning conference before returning to clean the stalls and pile manure outside. And then they went on and did everything else. She talks about making compost piles, growing things in the greenhouse. Like it was very intensive. They learned everything. And they had students from all over the place. So some of them didn't have much agricultural experience. So, also Evelyn Speeden Gregg says, well, who were these students? An interesting group of varying ages and religious and cultural backgrounds. The majority were men and women of college age and experience. The youngest were two 17-year-old boys from Chicago and New York City. Most were devoid of any experience of rural life. This made problems. The farm team ran away with one boy, not a 17-year-old either, who thought driving horses was a cinch, and a few fences went down. A tractor's water system froze one cold night when the person responsible forgot to drain it. Poison ivy, in spite of warnings, caused spells of misery when hedgerows were weeded and pruned. But it might have been worse. Differences and difficulties were no hindrance to the good times we had together. And so Paul Keen described his experience in this way. He said, the 1,000-acre farm project at Kimberton was run almost entirely by the 10 to 15 men and women students. It was tremendously hard work. Aside from the early tractors, modern farm labor-saving machines were just coming into use. We did much of our work with horses and by hand. We learned the cycles of the soil and its life. The hardships and the penury ran off our young shoulders. Only when we felt we had learned what we needed to know to go on our own as full-fledged farmers did we decide to leave. Sadly enough, not long after our departure, the farm school closed, never again to open. And so what happened was there was a split between Ehrenfried Pfeiffer and Alaric Marin, who was the one funding and operating this. Whatever it was, as Evelyn Spiden Gregg said, at Christmas time of 1943, the calamity was not death but a lifelong separation, the disagreement that terminated the relationship of Mr. Marin and Dr. Pfeiffer. And so what exactly the disagreement was, nobody actually recorded. I wonder if it had something to do with farm size and practicality, and I base that on something that Pfeiffer wrote in March of 1944, so just a few months after the split. He said, it has been my privilege to manage Kimberton Farms and Kimberton Farms Agricultural School, owned by Mr. H.A.W. Marin, for the last 3 years. And then he said, in drawing some conclusions from this work and in trying to understand the actual needs of the American farmer, particularly of the so-called dirt farmer who has to make a living on his farm, I felt that the small and medium mixed farm operator could not make immediate use of the experiences gained on a large farm, which is managed under different conditions. The average farmer wants to see the biodynamic method demonstrated under exactly the same conditions under which he has to work and make a living. For this reason, it seems necessary to find a moderate-sized farm in order to be able to demonstrate the value of the biodynamic method under the average farming conditions. And so he did this. He both remained firm advocates of biodynamics, but Pfeiffer went and bought his own farm in Chester, New York. Unfortunately, he came down with tuberculosis, probably brought on by all the stress, I would guess, of this, split with Marin and the loss of the farm school. So he was so sick. He was in the hospital for like 2 years. The doctors said you can't work with cows because you might give them tuberculosis. So his wife Adelheid managed the farm, and he wasn't able to do much until the late 1940s. So that was the end of the era of Kimberton. However, there was one other very important person that Kimberton influenced before it was closed, and that was J.I. Rodale. So in 1942, J.I. Rodale started using the term organic farming in his magazine, Organic Farming and Gardening. So organic farming and gardening, he's got this. So here's a picture of the first. So here's a picture of the first organic farming and gardening magazine. And I do think it may be significant that he used the phrase organic farming and gardening uses the same syntax as Pfeiffer's book, which was biodynamic farming and gardening. So I think there might be something there. But Pfeiffer, in his introductory article to this, he said, the subject of organic farming is new to the majority of farmers. In this country, it has been taken up on a limited scale only in the last few years. In Europe, England, Denmark, Switzerland, and Germany especially, it has been in use on a more extensive scale for many years, and its advantages have been tested widely. There are two methods that have been used, the biodynamic system and the indoor method, the latter receiving its name from the city of Indore in India, where it was first tried by Sir Albert Howard. They both have one thing in common, which is that they frown on the use of so-called chemical fertilizers. And so where did Rodale get this term organic farming? He was the one who standardized it and popularized it for sure, even though other people had used it before. And so the consensus was he got it from Northbourne, but Rodale never mentioned reading Northbourne's book, not until much, much later. And he could have learned it at the School of Living. It's totally possible. Perhaps he also heard it directly from Pfeiffer at Kimberton, or at least he must have heard that word organic somewhere, because that's where he started using that term organic farming. So again, that first issue of Organic Gardening included an article on biodynamics by Pfeiffer, along with an article on the indoor method of composting by Sir Albert Howard. And so when Rodale was lumping both of them into the same category, biodynamic composting and indoor composting, he said what is claimed roughly for these organic methods, referring to both the farming, is that they increase the fertility of the soil, produce much better tasting crops that are healthier for man and beast, reduce weeds, do away with the necessity of using poisonous sprays, improve the mechanical structure of the soil, enable it to retain moisture, and reduce soil erosion, etc. Now, I will note that Rodale used the term organic, strictly talking about like organic waste, organic composting. He did not really use that sense of the organic whole, the holistic sense. That was something that Rodale did not really talk about as much. So even though he was the one who used the word organic the most and it became the standard, his use of it did not have all of the meaning that the other people included in that term organic. However, they kept using it too, and I would say that for many people, the word organic always did have that deeper, that holistic, the farm as an organism, society as an organism, organic society, all of that, I think is still part of that word organic. So then the big question is, was there a falling out between Rodale and Pfeiffer? And I've had a lot of people ask me this, especially people in the biodynamic community. They're like, we heard there was this falling out, and what was the cause? And so this was fun. At the conference, I asked people what they thought the cause was. And some of them, and I'm going to talk about what I think are the most principal things here. And then, of course, one guy was like, there was a woman involved, but I do not think that was the cause. So I'm just going to leave that one off the table here. But the facts that we have are that Rodale printed Pfeiffer's articles in Organic Gardening Magazine right up through the early 1950s. In fact, right up through December of 1951. Pfeiffer was a frequent contributor. It wasn't quite once a month. Sometimes it was, but it was at least every 2 or 3 months. There was an article by him. And then so actually one thing before I go into the mouse study, one thing that Pfeiffer actually did was he contributed the first ever issue of The Organic Farmer, which was Rodale's magazine targeted directly at farmers. He wrote a summary of the organic farming method for that. So he was definitely one of the better writers who wrote for Rodale's magazines. So in 1947, after Sir Albert Howard died, J.I. Rodale decided to start a research foundation called the Soil and Health Foundation, which is actually the same entity that is now the Rodale Institute. It was kind of dormant for a few years, later on became the Rodale Institute in the 70s. But in the 1940s, it was the Soil and Health Foundation. And so the Soil and Health Foundation, Rodale's like, we're going to prove that organic food's better. So we're going to do this scientific study of mouse nutrition. So what they did was he partnered with Pfeiffer and they set up this mouse study. And so this mouse study, oops, I'm going ahead on my slides here, ignore that. So the mouse study, they had these white mice and they fed some of them wheat grown on organically fertilized wheat, and a lot of it was biodynamic, and then the rest of it was grown on mineral soil. And it turned out the results were, the Pfeiffer was like, this is really preliminary, but they did find that the organic group had a higher survival percentage, and they had fewer gastrointestinal disorders. So he noticed that the rats that ate the mineral fertilized wheat fought more than the ones that ate the organic wheat. So really interesting. And Rodale was like, "Ooh, we gotta get this published in some scientific journal," and they wouldn't accept it, so he was bummed at that. But there doesn't seem to have actually been a falling out there. So that was one of the theories, was that it was something to do with a research project. But I did not find any evidence. And now I'm going to give the caveat here that the records are very fragmentary. There's most of the correspondence between Rodale and Pfeiffer is missing, unfortunately, on both ends. It's not in Pfeiffer's archives and it's not in Rodale's archives. However, the historians at Lehigh University, as they were digitizing the Rodale archives, they ran across this reel of microfilm. And this reel of microfilm that nobody knew existed actually does have some of this correspondence from the late 1940s through the 1960s, which does cover this time period. So I do have a little bit of correspondence to base this on. And I think if there was a really major split, it likely would have been documented by this correspondence. So another possibility was that in 1949, J.I. Rodale introduced what he called the new organic method. The new organic method. And so the new organic method was what he, uh, so Rodale was like, okay, we really want to get organic farming out to the masses. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is for it to be easy enough, because composting is great and compost works great, but it's a lot of work. And your average farmer just plain doesn't have the time or the money to put that much work into making compost. So, what if we just do what we call sheet composting, which is where you take all those organic waste, but you just spread them on the field. You don't bother to make them into compost first. So he said in 1949, he's announcing what he calls the new organic method. And he's like, it is not necessary to have manure to farm by the organic method. Neither is it necessary to make compost. Here briefly is the method. Wherever possible, grow leguminous green manure crops for plowing or disking under. Rotate your crops properly, not making the rotation too short. Use the ground rock fertilizer like rock phosphate and potash or granite rocks, which are not too soluble and which do not force their nutrients on the plant. Also use ground limestone, preferably dolomite, which is rich in magnesium. If one can see one's way clear, it will pay to fallow a part of a farm each year. So he's saying you can manage soil fertility without making compost. And so that was a problem for Pfeiffer, because biodynamic farming is all about making the best compost possible. And in biodynamic farming, it is not good to put those organic wastes on the soil. That's not what you should do. And so I didn't find any correspondence between Pfeiffer and J.I. Rodale, but he had some correspondence with Robert Rodale about one of his articles he wrote in 1950. And Bob Rodale said, you say that the organic farmer will observe, when changing from other methods to organic management, a decrease in acidity. On our farm and on many other farms, the reverse has been true. And so what Pfeiffer said in reply, he said, I know that insufficient fermentation in composting, i.e. raw humus, does maintain an acid level. I have fought for many years to recognize the importance of the difference between acid raw humus and colloidal, neutral, or near to neutral humus. One of the main differences I had with Sir Albert Howard was that he did not pay attention to this difference. I have developed the biodynamic process in order to obtain the colloidal sweet humus. All organic scientists in the past have so far claimed that organics sweeten the soil. The facts on your farm do not contradict it. If you have not sweetened your soil, maybe you have not reached the goal and there is still something to do. This I feel I have to say as a scientist who has worked for 25 years in farming and organics. And so Bob Rodale was very polite in his reply. He's like, well, thank you. Your letter has explained several questions that confused me. I still do not agree with you 100%, but I will be glad to publish your article in its present form with all respect to your knowledge, background, and reputation. I do not want to give the impression that I question your statements as not being the words of a definitive scientist. I was interested in determining the correctness of my own observations. So that doesn't sound like a split to me, because Bob Rodale was like, yeah, sorry. I mean, I get it. Like, you're a scientist. I respect you. Great. So I'm not seeing any split there, just like I didn't see any split with the research. So Pfeiffer was wondering if the sheet composting would acidify soils. So I don't think there was actually a split. So then here's the question. Was there a split? And the only reason I think there could have been something was because, again, Pfeiffer was writing articles every month or two or three, right up until December of 51, and then that was it. There weren't any more articles published by him in organic gardening. Why? And so I was like, what happened? Now there's 2 to 3 months lead with magazine articles. So whatever he had written in December would have been submitted in like September or October. So it's like, what happened around then that may have made Pfeiffer not write more articles for Organic Gardening magazine? And so here's my theory. September 1951, we get this unfortunate article in Country Gentleman, which was a widely read farming magazine at the time. It was called The Organic Farming Myth by Ray L. Throckmorton, or Ray I. Throckmorton. And what Throckmorton, who was the dean of Kansas State College, said, in recent years, there's grown up in this country a cult of misguided people who call themselves organic farmers and who would, if they could, destroy the chemical fertilizer industry on which so much of our agriculture depends. These so-called organic farmers preach a strange, true doctrine, compounded mainly of pure superstition and myth, with just enough half-truths, pseudoscience, and emotion thrown in to make their statements sound plausible to the uninformed. I'm like, whoa, wait, where did this come from? Because organic farming seemed pretty scientific, if what Pfeiffer was saying about it just a few months before that. So what happened? What we had, 1950, was the U.S. House of Representatives started a committee to investigate the safety of chemicals in food products. They had a bunch of different categories. They were looking at different kinds of food additives like bread softeners, all sorts of artificial preservatives, things like that. They were looking at stilbestrol in meat. They were looking at pesticides and the effect of pesticide residues on human health in food, and they were looking at chemical fertilizers and whether food grown with chemical fertilizers was nutritionally inferior. And that came directly from the organic movement, because it was the organic farmers who were saying that chemical fertilizers were not as good as organic fertilizers. So, in order to defend chemical fertilizers, the scientists started claiming that fertilizer was necessary to feed the world. And in order to prove that you had to have chemical fertilizer to feed the world, they had to try to prove that organic farming didn't work, because if organic farming could feed the world just fine without chemicals, there was no point for chemicals. They could have got outlawed, and they sure didn't want that to happen. So that's why they started, that's the context in which Throckmorton wrote this article. So J.I. Rodale, he had a sense of humor. He was a funny guy, and he tried to, when adversity happened, he tried to make a joke out of it. So the way he responded to Throckmorton's article was he said Throckmorton's writing was so full of error that I began to think of him as Mr. Throckmutton. I mean, if he wants to call names, two can play the same game, and it can be lots of fun. So Rodale's like, I'm not gonna take this too seriously. Let's make a joke out of it. He's saying such crazy stuff. I'll refute it, but you gotta see the funny side of this, that a scientist at an agricultural university would say things like, so in this graphic here, if you can't read it, it says super organic sideshow. See our ultra colossal pile of compost. Note our healthy, happy earthworms. Try our miracle mixture, guaranteed non-scientific. So that was, Rodale and the chemical people were getting into it over this. And Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, unfortunately, did not have, he was an amazing man, but he doesn't seem to have had very much of a sense of humor. And I don't think he really appreciated Rodale's sense of humor very much. And my suspicion is I'm basing this from an article that he wrote for Biodynamics, his own magazine, in sometime in 1952. And he's talking about this debate. And he said, occasional emotional outbursts on both sides of the argument can be left out of the picture. They help neither cause. We need only take an objective stand in making an inventory of present-day knowledge. The writer has spent more than 25 years in the study of organic matter in soils. He does not take part in some of the outbursts of the organic movement, for he is a scientist for whom only facts count. Nor does he share in the attitude of the other side that chemical fertilizers will solve all the problems of survival. Somewhere between the two, there must exist a workable path, which must be sought for the sake of the maintenance of fertile soils. The writer has tried, therefore, to apply scientific methods to the organic idea. So he was trying to take a middle ground, which was very commendable. It was, unfortunately, it did not work. Another one who tried to take a middle ground was Louis Bromfield, who got marginalized. And as I record in my book, Malabar Farm, and Pfeiffer got marginalized too. You couldn't take a middle ground on this, unfortunately, as nice as that sounded, because the scientists were not actually being scientific. And yeah, I talk about that in my talk about Can Organic Farming Feed the World, if you want to hear more about that. So my theory is that this came out in September 1951. Pfeiffer's last article in Organic Gardening was published in December of 51, so probably submitted right around that time. My suspicion is not that it wasn't necessarily Rodale said, oh, we won't publish your articles, but more that Pfeiffer didn't want his name associated with organic gardening after that because he was trying to maintain his credibility as a scientist. So that is just a theory. I do not have facts to back that up. I'm only basing this on chronology. However, I do want to point out that J.I. Rodale still greatly respected Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. And I know this because Pfeiffer passed away in November of 1961. And this is the November 30th of 1961. And so this is the memorial that J.I. Rodale wrote about Pfeiffer in his obituary in Organic Gardening magazine. He said, Dr. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, head of the Biodynamic Farming and Gardening Association, passed away on the morning of November 30th, 1961, following a heart attack. He was 62 years old. It was a great shock and a terrible blow to the whole organic biodynamic movement. I want to point out, he was saying they were the same, organic biodynamic, one movement working together. That's what he said here. He said Dr. Pfeiffer's influence and inspiration was incalculable, and he will never be replaced. I owe him many obligations, especially in the earlier years of the organic movement when I called upon him again and again to answer technical questions for me. And Dr. Pfeiffer was unquestionably a genius, and his loss will be felt for many years to come. We at Organic Gardening and Farming mourn his loss. Now, to me, that does not sound like there was a split there. There may have been some minor disagreements, but J.I. Rodale still greatly respected Pfeiffer and was very, he grieved a lot when Pfeiffer died. And so, at least on Rodale's side, I don't find a lot of evidence that there really was a split between them, or that there really ever was a huge split between biodynamics and mainstream organic farming. The two movements have always been intertwined. And here are just a few of what I consider to be some of Pfeiffer's most important lasting contributions to organic farming. The concept of the farm as an organic whole, that is very important. I think that's baked into the idea of organic, and that came from Pfeiffer. Mixed crop and animal farming, that you need both on the farm to really truly do nutrient cycling properly. And again, Sir Albert Hauer also recommended this, so it came from both, but Pfeiffer was definitely one of the ones. The importance of good composting methods. That was Pfeiffer had the biodynamic compost was the best quality compost. They had really good compost, and Pfeiffer went on to do a composting plant in Oakland, California, and he really tried to promote composting everywhere he went, and that was a really important legacy. He also had a passion for promoting organic and biodynamic farming on a large scale. He wanted all farming to be biodynamic at some point, or organic. He was fine if they didn't use the word biodynamic. He just wanted these principles to get across. And he also helped provide a scientific, practical foundation for organic farming. You needed both. You needed Rodale's humor and all that, and then you needed Pfeiffer's scientific, like this is the science, and trying to be objective and all that. And they were a good pair for each other. I feel like we needed both of them. And so I think Ehrenfried Pfeiffer's contribution to organic farming was very important and should definitely be recognized. So if you have any questions about this presentation, feel free to email me through my website, which is historyoforganic.com. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please sign up for my weekly blog. I post on all sorts of interesting topics and will keep you updated on my next book, which will be coming out soon. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.